Good evening, everybody. I'm Howard Spiegler, co-chair of the Art Law Group here at Herrick. Larry Kay, as I'm sure you know, one of our panelists, is the other co-chair. And we welcome you to this, the second event this year in our continuing series with the Art newspaper of panel discussions covering business issues affecting the art world. Our topic today is again a very timely one: looted art and antiquities in the Middle East. As most of you know, our Art Law Group specializes in all aspects of the art world, from restitution and other litigation to art transactions, tax questions, estate issues, and really anything else that might impact the arts community. But it's particularly special for Larry and me to host this session dealing with the looting of antiquities. When we were young men in our early years of practice, so I'm talking many, many years ago, our first art law cases involved our recovery of antiquities from museums, collectors, and others on behalf of so-called art-rich nations like the Republic of Turkey. People were pretty shocked in those days that we were actually arguing that these looted antiquities, comfortably housed in some of the world's great museums and elsewhere, should be returned to their countries of origin. We're gratified that today, for the most part, there's an understanding that looted antiquities and other cultural property should indeed be returned to their homelands. But as we will see tonight, many difficult issues still need to be addressed in this area. I'm very pleased to introduce our moderator tonight. Julia Halpern is museums editor of the Art newspaper. As a journalist and editor for several years, Julia has covered a wide variety of issues affecting the art world and is known for her excellence at making the most complex topics understandable to the art world and to the general public. Julia will introduce our distinguished panelists tonight and will lead the discussion. Thank you very much. Julia?
So I just wanted to start and acknowledge the victims of the attack in Istanbul, which is a reminder that the turmoil that's happening in this region does not just affect cultural heritage, but has a very human toll. And we're also here to talk about what's being done to preserve the cultural heritage in Syria and Iraq. Over the past few years, we've been bombarded with images of shattered ancient statues and clouds of smoke hovering over archaeological sites. Not too long ago, these images would have stopped us cold. But with a new report of cultural destruction seeming to surface every few weeks, they have become instead a somewhat regular, if horrific, part of checking Twitter and Facebook. Just today, the Art newspaper posted an article on its website about the destruction of the Temple of Nabu and Nimrud, a 9th century temple in northern Iraq. Video footage released by ISIS earlier this month showed part of that temple being blown up. As a journalist, it's often difficult to figure out how to cover this kind of violence. It's hard to know whether reproducing images of ISIS's choreographed destruction is a necessary part of educating the public, or whether it makes us complicit in spreading terrorist propaganda. What does it mean when the destruction of Palmyra goes viral? And how can we accurately determine what has been lost if we only have carefully edited photographs and video footage to go on? Our panel today will aim to cut through the noise and present evidence-based research on destruction currently underway in Syria and Iraq. We'll also look at how ISIS and others are using the illicit antiquities trade to fund their activities and discuss how measures in the US and worldwide are aiming to combat looting. In May, President Obama signed into law the Protect and Preserve International Cultural Property Act, which seeks to restrict the import of Syrian antiquities into the US. A much stricter and farther-reaching law passed in the lower house of German parliament last week and is due to be taken up by the upper house early next month. We'll also talk about what role museums and the market can and do play in this crisis. Museums have been eager to contribute their expertise, but have yet to broadly coordinate their efforts. The British Museum, the Louvre, and the Getty have all launched exchange and training programs with their colleagues in Iraq and Syria. And last fall, the Association of Art Museum Directors published a new set of protocols to encourage its 240 member museums to act as safe havens for threatened objects in conflict zones. These institutions understand that the ancient objects in their collections won't mean much to future generations if they can't understand where they came from. This region and its history is of significance to all of us. It is known as the cradle of civilization because it houses the origins of much of modern society. If you like reading, telling time, or appreciate the rule of law, which, considering where we are, I'm going to assume that you probably do, you have ancient Mesopotamia to thank. It is one of the earliest complex civilizations and sprung up in what is now Iraq more than 5,000 years ago. It is considered home to some of the earliest known books, schools, and calendar systems. Today we'll be hearing about the latest efforts to preserve that history. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Going first will be Catherine Hansen, an archaeologist and Smithsonian Fellow at Smithsonian's Museum Conservation Institute. She'll be discussing how archaeologists are using satellite imagery to track looting and the potential impact of the Protect and Preserve International Cultural Property Act. Lawrence Kay is a partner and co-chair of the art law firm at Herrick Feinstein. He will outline the latest legal developments in the field, how today's smuggling is different from that of the past, and what collectors and institutions can do to avoid ending up in an ownership dispute. Peter Herdich is the CEO of the Cultural Capital Group and the co-founder of the Antiquities Coalition, an international NGO that seeks to fight looting. He will discuss the Culture Under Threat Task Force report released by the coalition in April and offer recommendations for dealers, auction houses, museums, and collectors. Zakir Yilmaz is an expert at the Ministry of Culture and Tourism in Turkey. He will discuss Turkey's response to the crisis and its efforts to preserve Syrian cultural patrimony. And finally, Brian Daniels is the Director of Research and Programs for the Penn Cultural Heritage Center at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. He will discuss his work to support heritage professionals in conflict zones and explain how evidence that is being collected today can be used to contribute to the long-term preservation of these sites down the line. Now I'd like to give the floor over to our first speaker, Catherine Hansen.
Thank you, Julia. Is this on?
Yeah.
Can everyone hear me?
No, louder.
All right. Louder? Okay. I might just hold this like that. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Julia, and thank you all for coming out tonight. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me, and I also want to join Julia in extending my sympathies to those in Istanbul. It's an airport that we've all been through many times and is very important on the world stage. It may seem strange that in the face of really violent events, to be talking about cultural heritage. And it's something as someone who, because I work in Iraq, as someone who works in Iraq, it's something that I've had to deal with quite a bit. And one of the things that I've thought about in light of this is that in the face of violence, in the face of destruction, it is important for us to focus on cultural heritage because that's part of our identity. It's part of building a future, and it's part of our children's future. So with that said, I want to kind of move into the rest of what I wanted to talk about tonight. As Julia said, I'm an archaeologist, and tonight I'll be speaking in my personal capacity based off my individual research and experiences working in both Iraq and Syria. And I'm going to start a timer to make sure I don't go too badly over time. I'm going to give us the example of Raqqa to begin with. Raqqa is now the capital of the so-called caliphate. It's a place where I did some of my dissertation work, and therefore it's very close to my heart. But it's also a good example of a city that has been damaged in pretty much every way, and its cultural heritage has been damaged in every way there. So from satellite images and colleagues on the ground, we know the damage has occurred to ancient and historical heritage sites through airstrikes, unregulated construction, intentional destruction, looting, and so on. At the Raqqa Museum, there's been direct conflict damage and looting. At the archaeological sites in and around Raqqa, they've been bulldozed for building material, built upon, and looted. At 3 medieval saints' shrines in Raqqa, each one of those shrines has been blown up by ISIS. And then, or beforehand, they were looted. So looting is taking place in Raqqa, and that part's very clear, and it's connected to many of the ways damage is occurring. We're going to talk a bit more tonight about the Protect and Preserve Act, but it's important, before we get into that, to talk about the scope of the problem, to talk about why this act took place, and to talk a little bit about what is fueling all of that looting that's going on. You've all seen the dramatic moonscapes, the satellite images that I work with and others work with that show pockmarked sites, surfaces divoted out, just completely wrecked by looters' pits going across. And those images from the space, they only show the surface. They don't even show the tunnels that are taking place under the ground. So when we talk about the scope of the problem, please keep in mind that it is every one of the famous ancient sites in Syria. It is the vast majority of small shrines and small churches across the country. It really has been throughout that nation, and it's something that continues to take place to this day. The most famous of Syria's sites, for instance, Dura Europos, the Pompeii of the desert, has been looted as an industrial scale. If you need an example here in New York of how amazing Dura Europos is and how much potential that site could have had, I suggest you go to the Met and take a look at these gorgeous wall paintings from one of the oldest synagogues known. They come from one of these great preservation areas at Dura Europos where you're really able to get some beautiful classical remains. We have no idea what else was there because that has since been systematically looted by ISIS. At sites like Mari, which has got an incredible second millennium archive of cuneiform tablets, we've seen systematic looting to sell and try and get more of those tablets. Mari is one of the reasons we know what the ancient world looked like. Similarly, at the Syrian site of Ebla, it was the seat of a kingdom in the early Bronze Age. There also was a very important archive, and much of the looting there has taken place to try and get more tablets like at that archive. We have all seen Palmyra in the news recently. I'm not going to rehash what you're probably already familiar with, except to say that these sites are very clearly targets, and they've been targets from the beginning, such as the site of Apamea, which is a classical site, and that site has been systematically looted since the start of the instability in Syria. And that's just a handful, right, of just vast numbers of cultural sites and archaeological sites that have been damaged. I bring up a variety of sites also because I want to make a point that it isn't just ISIS who is looting, that looting is irregular financing for irregular forces, money coming in to fund people. It definitely has been done by ISIS. ISIS has had the most systematic looting taking place, but it definitely isn't only ISIS looting. Looting takes place in crisis conditions when the rule of law breaks down. And it takes place because there is profit at the end of it. I've been in Iraq in the summer. I've been in Syria in the summer. I can tell you no one is taking a shovel out in the desert in 120-degree heat to dig artifacts out of the ground unless they're motivated by money. Seriously, there's no reason they're just doing this for the fun of it. There is a demand for the stuff, and that's why these sites are being ripped up. And I have to add that it's not just sites, it's also museums. And we know this because of Iraq in 2003. I started working on these issues around 2003 and 2004, and we have import restrictions and have had import restrictions in place since 2008 on cultural heritage material coming out of Iraq. We knew that was very much something we would need for Syria when the violence in Syria started. H.R. 1493 is also an important extension of the existing law for Iraq because the cultural material that comes out of Iraq and Syria is very similar. One of the problematic loopholes in enforcing cultural heritage import restrictions is that cultural material can look similar. You can say, well, it's a classical coin, so it could have come from anywhere. And that's true. There are, however, in particularly the Mesopotamian region, the area between the Tigris and the Euphrates, types of material that is unique to that region. So the Iraqi material, which looks similar to the Syrian material, is also helped by having import restrictions on the Syrian material. So I mentioned museums for Iraq. I also want to talk briefly about a specific instance of Iraqi cultural material showing up, having been stolen from a museum in Syria, and that's the Abu Saif raid. Last spring, in May, Abu Saif was raided by U.S. Special Forces in Deir ez-Zor in Syria, and somewhere around, and the estimates have come out in different places for different numbers, but around 750 cultural heritage objects were recovered with Abu Saif during this raid. Abu Saif was an ISIS official. He was in charge of the sort of what you call natural resources department for ISIS. He was in charge of oil sales. He was in charge of other sort of profiting from natural resources. Antiquities count as part of that. And as a result, he was found with a bunch of documents and computer files and receipts and artifacts that he was trying to sell, and had the evidence that he had successfully sold other artifacts earlier too. And so of these approximately 750 cultural heritage artifacts, one of the really important items is an ivory plaque that was excavated by the British at Nimrud in the 1920s. And in addition to that plaque, which we knew and had been published and had an Iraqi museum number on it, there was also a variety of small objects that either had notes or had Iraqi museum inventory numbers listed on it. So it's very clear that ISIS was directly connected to these objects. I think that for other details for the Abu Saif raid, I would recommend you look them up, because it is really striking, and it shows the direct connection between ISIS and profiting from looting. Right now, in Fallujah, as Iraqi forces go into it, they're documenting the fact that homes and buildings have been heavily looted by ISIS. Back in March, we started getting reports that everything that could be taken, household items, heritage items that were in homes and in public institutions, were being taken down into ISIS-held areas and then auctioned off. And that is something that has been taking place in a variety of locations, especially as ISIS leaves. I think one example I'd like to bring up, particularly because it links this looting of houses and heritage houses with the Western market, is an example of an ornamental lintel from a Jewish heritage house in Syria. This was a stylized menorah on the lintel. It showed up in a TV series in 2005 in a London Antiquities shop, and it was shown on TV, which prompted UK police to go and seize it. Prior to it showing up then, the last time it had been documented was in 1988 by the Department General of Antiquities and Museums in Syria, and had a long published record, which is why it was able to be seized. This example is from London in the UK, but there's every reason to suspect that we have similar examples here in the US just waiting to take place. And with that, I'd like to say thank you.
Thank you so much. So now I'm going to turn it over to Larry, who we've talked a little bit about sort of what happens, how these things get dug up, and Larry's going to talk about what happens once they leave the ground and make their way over the borders and the legal issues that arise from that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd also like to say to Zakir Bey and the other Turkish officials in the room that we're devastated by what happened in Istanbul today, and that we are in solidarity with you. And I also have been thinking about programs like this when events like that occur. But there is a connection. We're here to talk about saving our cultural heritage, but as you'll hear about more, and you've heard about already, ISIS and other groups are using this to make a lot of money, and that money is financing the terrorist activities enveloping our world in Turkey and everywhere else. And so I think the mission of the people who are trying to stem the flow of the smuggled antiquities has a small part to play in trying to curb the activities that lead to the events that happen today. I just want to spend a moment to embellish what Howard said. We began our work with Turkey back in 1987 when we were retained to recover a hoard of 300 or more antiquities known as the Lydian Hoard or Karun's Treasure from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was our first foray into the antiquities market and the legal consequences of that. And at the time, there wasn't much attention being paid, even though the UNESCO Convention had been adopted in 1970 and implemented to some extent in the United States by the Cultural Property Implementation Act in 1983, I think. And we were surprised that there was still a don't ask, don't tell policy in terms of many museums' acquisition policies. And we were surprised as we got more into the field to see that it wasn't changing as much as we thought it was supposed to after 1970. But attitudes have changed over time. And when you look at what's happening in the world today, it's interesting how a media frenzy has a way of making people think more about problems that they might not otherwise worry about. And that's why there's so much attention being paid to this today. Back in the 80s, it was instructive to learn about the smuggling networks who worked with looters in impoverished areas to whisk Turkish antiquities from their resting places in the dark of night. And we were impressed by how swiftly they went to Germany and then to London and the US. As you will see, those routes have really not changed that much, but they are being used a lot more. In any event, we were happy to embark on our 20-year relationship with Turkey, during which we recovered not only the Lydian Hoard, but many other antiquities and stolen cultural treasures. 20 years ago, and since I've talked in lectures about how the illicit trade was a huge industry, and sad to say it's bigger today, especially with what ISIS and other groups are doing. So I'm happy to see that the illicit trade, I'm unhappy to see that while the illicit trade is alive and well, that so many people throughout the world, newly sensitive to these problems, are starting to take steps to do what they can. And my hope is that when hostilities die down, and I hope they will, in Syria and Iraq, those same people will continue to be alert to the run-of-the-mill smuggling that has been a big problem for so many decades but didn't get enough attention. As to what kinds of disputes are arising now and will arise out of the conflict in Syria and Iraq, they're really the same ones that have been prevalent for decades. The problem is that they are exacerbated by the sheer volume of the new illicit trade that will result, and may have some unique wrinkles as well. As you know, and we've heard about it already, there's a new U.S. law that hopefully will provide stronger enforcement and prevention than the more traditional laws like the NSPA and the CPI have done in the past. We will know soon, because the laws are so new, and other countries are passing legislation as well. It's part of a global effort, hopefully led by the U.S. Historically, there's been clarity on what countries will be able to bring actions to repatriate the looted property. But now, with the instability in the region, it may be difficult to figure out what the agreed parties, who the agreed parties really are. The U.S. Congress passed the Protect and Preserve International Cultural Property, which imposes a much stronger ban on cultural property from Syria than the CPIA allowed, and has lifted some of the limitations. And hopefully that ban will work. There's controversy about it. Many in the cultural property community and the market question whether the ban is even necessary, suggesting that there's really no evidence of Syrian artifacts actually coming into the country. And they think the bill is a response to the media frenzy and making claims about a multi-billion-dollar market. Others see the law as a response and not a prevention item. They argue that the only way to deal with the problem is to prevent the looting. They claim the U.S. legislation will not stem the flow. We shall see. Germany has followed suit with its historic new law, which is really not primarily intended to deal with the cultural property antiquities flow problem, but more so to protect German cultural patrimony, though there's a lot of controversy there about exactly what that means. And I don't know if the hysteria that's now arising in Germany, where all of the dealers are threatening to leave, will really take place, but we'll know more in July after the legislation passes. As has been mentioned, there have been restrictions imposed by the UN for years on Iraq. On the other hand, if you look at the statistics, millions of dollars worth of Iraqi antiquities still make their way into the U.S. market. It'll be interesting to see whether these new laws will work better. One problem with antiquity smuggling 30 years ago and now is that documentation can be altered. How exactly will the relevant authorities know that the objects came from Iraq or Syria? That has become a perennial problem. Customs documents are forged, they're altered, and the trade sometimes is complicit. The true test will be whether all of these pieces of legislation work. There have been import restrictions on Iraq antiquities since 2004, but I say they haven't worked perfectly. We can expect disputes from arise from the new measures being adopted to deal with the crisis, such as the AAMD safe haven protocols, which to some extent are incorporated in the new Syrian law. Though implemented with lofty motives and goals, I foresee disputes arising, not so much when the artifacts are delivered, but after hostilities subside or disappear. Considering the instability in the region, there will be issues as to whether the surviving nation or museum is really the rightful owner and whether they're really going to be a trustworthy savior of the assets. And since even individuals and companies may make deposits, there could be situations where depositors who came upon the artifacts illegally and deposited them seek their return. It's predicted that U.S. lawyers will have a field day helping museums document the deposit system and representing museums when they are confronted with claimants who want the assets back at the end of the hostilities. They may run into problems with local law enforcement if they have antiquities that they have in safe haven that have been stolen. They may run into different legal issues when they refuse to give the deposit back because they don't trust the person seeking it, and then they're accused of wrongful appropriation. So there'll be plenty to discuss, but that'll be later. As far as I understand it, there have been no deposits yet under the safe haven, though I understand that people are waiting for the law to take effect, which won't be for a few months yet. And then there supposedly will be a flow of deposits either from museums or governments or individuals, and we'll see how that will work. The paths that the smugglers are using and are the same old. The difference is that the looting networks are larger, more organized and more sophisticated. ISIS started out soliciting excavators and charging taxes ranging from 20 to 50% of profits. Then they started contracting out the excavations. And finally, they hired their own archaeologists and diggers and set up the machinery for mass marketing and selling. The destruction we read about occurred only after saleable assets were removed. And the organized business-like control of the looting has led to an increase in smuggling and helped move the illicit market into the billions. Once this is accomplished, the routes are the familiar ones. They start with the looting in Syria and Iraq, often pass through Turkey and Lebanon and make their way to Germany and Switzerland, picking up documentation along the way, and then hit the markets in New York and London. And there's even more sophistication now, where the internet's being used both to research potential market and effectuate sales. Zakir Bey, when he speaks, will tell you about how Turkey is dealing with the problem of the border, which is over 600 miles long, and Turkey is doing amazing things to try to stem the flow and preserve the cultural property flowing out. But I'll let him take care of that because he's the expert. Lastly, what can collectors and institutions do to prevent ending up in an ownership dispute over these new illicit antiquities? The same thing they've always done or should have done, adopting strict due diligence measures. But that has worked only sporadically in the past and may not work any better in the future. I've always said that the key to a successful black market are the so-called legitimate end users. But these end users, while perhaps legitimate in the eyes of the public, taint themselves forever by buying looting antiquities they know or well should know, have an illicit past, and here a very recent illicit past. Over the years, we've heard the stories, such as one case we were involved in when a major museum bought a life-size statue with fresh dirt still on it. There's no doubt that the lure of extraordinarily unique and valuable objects would be too much for some passionate collectors to ignore, and museums as well. Obviously, the answer is to take special care. Warnings have been issued by the authorities that stolen objects from Syria and Iraq may be on the market. Care must be taken to make sure that the people you're buying from are legitimate. The provenance must be examined. It must hold up. There must be documentation, including permits and licenses where they're available. And the authenticity of all this must be scrutinized. We remember the Schultz case, rather famous, where they documented a history of the artifacts in a family in England for over 100 years that was totally made up, but a lot of people fell for it. So only deal with reputable sellers, see who the sellers are down the line, check out the new ICOM Red List and other portals to see what they've been identified as at risk. I was asked to say that because I'm on the Legal Affairs Committee of ICOM, and they told me I had to say that. But it's true. They just issued a new list with respect to Syria, Iraq, and that's worth consulting. Some museums still say the objects are better off being bought by them than being in the market. But 25 years ago, archaeologists and others pointed out that such practices encourage the market by ensuring an end user willing to pay. They will now as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm now going to literally pass the mic to Peter, who's going to talk a bit more about best practices for the trade and institutions.
Thank you, Julia. Give me just a sec. We'll see if we can get this to work properly here. And that way I can gesticulate. Okay, so thank you everybody for joining us here tonight. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Howard, for putting on such a great program for us this evening. It's always nice to follow a ringing endorsement of due diligence and the importance of provenance. Thanks, Larry, for that. I'm here in my capacity with the Antiquities Coalition tonight, and I'm going to tell you this evening about an important initiative from our organization. It's called the Culture Under Threat Task Force, and we've recently published our task force report. It proposes 31 very specific recommendations to address the ongoing cultural racketeering crisis, including steps that can be taken by the Obama administration, Congress, the United Nations, and importantly, the art market. So, a little bit about the report's background. The Antiquities Coalition, the Asia Society here in New York, and the Middle East Institute from Washington, D.C., convened the Culture Under Threat Task Force to counter threats to our world heritage and to national security. The task force members included an eclectic array of leaders from the heritage, law enforcement, legal, military, and security communities. The first time such a diverse group of experts has come together to develop a comprehensive range of solutions. The task force builds on our 2015 Cairo conference, where ministers from 10 key Middle Eastern and North African countries agreed to take steps together against cultural racketeering. Now, the U.S. makes up 43% of the global art market and leads world demand for illicit and potentially for illicit antiquities. While we bear responsibility for finding solutions, we're not in this alone. This set of recommendations that we are proposing does not engage with source countries and what they can do to fight cultural racketeering. But we are working with the source countries now, and through the Cairo Declaration process, we will continue to do that, and that will be the focus of our next report. So getting to the recommendations, what does the Culture Under Threat Task Force call for? I'll give you a brief overview of our requests from the federal government and from the international community, and we can delve a little deeper into the specifics of a couple of proposals, but we're specifically targeting to the art market. So, for the federal government, the task force calls on the President to block the import of conflict antiquities through executive action, and to designate a senior director at the National Security Council to drive U.S. policy in the fight against blood antiquities and terrorist financing. We called on the U.S. Congress to pass the Protect and Preserve Cultural Property Act to restrict antiquities imports from Syria, and as Dr. Hansen and Larry both said, that goal has been accomplished. We call on the U.S. Department of Defense to consider, as appropriate, the launch of airstrikes when extremist organizations threaten heritage sites, to further identify no-strike lists of cultural heritage sites, to improve and standardize cultural property protection training for all military personnel, and to increase the number of cultural heritage specialists in the U.S. Army and Marine Corps Civil Affairs units. We've called on U.S. law enforcement to buttress immigration and customs enforcement seize and repatriate strategy with investigations and prosecutions to dismantle criminal networks engaged in the antiquities black market, as well as to provide additional resources for those efforts. That's really important. And for the U.S. Justice Department to end impunity by appointing dedicated prosecutors with expertise in heritage crimes, modeled on what they do with wildlife trafficking. Now, for the international community, the task force calls on the UN to urge the International Criminal Court to open an investigation of cultural crimes in Iraq and Syria, to include the safeguarding of cultural resources in peacekeeping training and mandates, to incorporate heritage protection in post-conflict planning. That's something that we'll hear more about as we move forward and as conflicts across the Middle East move along. There's a real possibility for great work there, and a possibility for a huge problem as well. And to support the capacity of national courts to conduct domestic prosecutions of cultural racketeering and cleansing. We don't have that much time, so I'd like to spend my remaining minutes on just a couple of specific proposals for the art market. Number one, art market players should pledge to be fully transparent in their dealings, making publicly available documentation of legal title and known ownership history for all antiquities. The international agreements, national law, industry codes, and best practice all require the art market to practice due diligence when dealing in cultural property. Likewise, the Association of Art Museum Directors guidelines include an additional, quote, requirement for provenance demonstrating that the object was out of its country of modern discovery prior to or legally exported therefrom after 17 November 1970 with certain exceptions. That's the end of the quote. These laws and policies seek not only to prevent antiquities trafficking, as well as fraud and money laundering, but also, and I think this is very important, to protect individual and institutional collectors from unknowingly dealing in looted antiquities, fakes, or forgeries. However, the existing system is largely relied on self-enforcement, and compliance is often weak or non-existent, as shown by the series of recent scandals, investigations, litigation, and prosecutions. In light of these system failures, art market players should pursue full transparency dealings by making publicly available documentation of legal title and known ownership history for all antiquities. Number two, museums that receive public funding should adopt a disclosure policy that follows the intent of the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA. Now, virtually all museums receive public funding in the form of their tax-exempt status, and with this comes increased responsibility to adhere to the highest possible standards of transparency. Although museums are not legally subject to the Freedom of Information Act, which gives the public the right to request access to records from any federal agency, those who receive direct or indirect public financing should operate consistently with its principles of disclosure. Such a position is already practiced by the Smithsonian, which operates a records request policy that follows the spirit of FOIA in order to, quote, foster openness and accountability. Number three, a relevant professional organization should establish a registry of antiquities dealers who are verified to abide by prescribed ethical codes and industry best practices. Recent arrests, prosecutions, and convictions of art dealers for cultural property crimes have exposed some industry practices in the art market that are unethical and unlawful. These illegal activities often harm responsible dealers as much as they do our shared cultural heritage. The task force urges the art market to establish a registry of approved antiquities dealers who would be screened for compliance with industry ethics codes, and relevant criminal records. Any registered dealer found to be in violation would be removed. The database should also be fully open to law enforcement, and such a registry could be developed and maintained by a dealer's trade organization. Number 5, and this is the last one we'll discuss in this section, because incidents of looting often remain undiscovered until the objects surface on the market, and thus no records of their theft exist, we call upon stolen art databases to cease certifying antiquities. Now, while databases are a valuable tool in tracking, reporting, and recovering art stolen from public and private collections, they are of limited use for looted antiquities. When an object is removed clandestinely from an archaeological site, as opposed to a storeroom or a museum, no records of theft are recorded. Stolen art databases are routinely able to issue certificates stating that antiquities were not registered as stolen, which are then used as a sign of due diligence by some collectors, dealers, and museums. Now, as an example, the Art Loss Register, quote, the world's largest database of stolen art, unquote, has provided certificates for a number of illicit antiquities that were later linked to such prolific traffickers as Subhash Kapoor and Giacomo Medici. Databases of stolen art should thus make the limitations of their certificates better known to potential clients. Art market players should not rely on them for ancient art, but should treat them as just one step of many in the due diligence process. Those are those 4 efforts are particular things that we talked about for the art market. And you can see that the issues of ownership and due diligence are the through line to these recommendations. Now, there are specific recommendations that could, there are other specific recommendations that could be brought to bear to protect cultural heritage. And the Antiquities Coalition is in touch with market players on more specific ideas and for creating recommendations for the market. And here, then, I make an offer to all of you. If you're interested in participating in the process of developing these recommendations and would like to serve, please contact us at cultureunderthreat@theantiquitiescoalition.org. We need to have, one of the things that we believe at the Antiquities Coalition is that this is a huge problem. It requires experts from across all sorts of areas, and that if we are able to do this, we're going to be able to do it best by reaching out to the art market, reaching out to experts in the legal field, et cetera. So we really do warmly welcome participation in this. We are happy to distribute the task force report to all so that you can see that. You can see it at the antiquitiescoalition.org website, or I'm hoping we'll be able to distribute it to all the attendees so you can get a deeper understanding of all our recommendations. And finally, one last thought. We have the great good fortune tonight to be joined by the author of the Culture Under Threat report, Tess Davis, who is the executive director of the Antiquities Coalition. And I would personally like to thank Tess expansively for her tremendous service in doing this as project director, and would even suggest a round of applause. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you. Is this working now? Yes? Okay, well, we've heard a lot about efforts that are underway on the U.S. side, and now to travel halfway around the world, we will hear from Zakir about efforts that Turkey is undertaking right next door to Syria.
Thank you, Ms. Halperin. First of all, I would like to thank the Herrick Law Firm and Art Newspaper for organizing such a panel and for inviting us. Also, I would like to thank you all for coming. I wish we met in different conditions, but it's like we can do nothing. We had opportunities to exchange views or to share information about safeguarding in cultural heritage. Sorry? Can you? Okay, I will try. Okay. We had opportunities to exchange views and to share information about safeguarding Syrian cultural heritage with our American colleagues or American law enforcement officers in Turkey or at international platforms. But this is the first time we are attending such a panel in the US. Therefore, I attach great importance to this panel discussion in the sense that it will give us a chance to share the correct information and to prevent information pollution. I'm proud to say that Turkey is one of the first countries that made legislation about conserving cultural heritage and preventing illicit trade in the second half of the 19th century. But for more than a century, we have been suffering from looting of cultural heritage carried out by illegal diggers or smugglers having various carriers. Regretfully today, we can still observe a manuscript having a Turkish library seal on it, on action catalogs. Also, we still observe that Interpol stolen artifact database recorded crown lives in museums collections. World's recent attention towards looted cultural heritage as a result of regional conflicts and measures taken for the protection of them are both appreciated. But the fact that illegal trade of cultural property being carried out by organized criminal networks is not a new case. If the necessary measures to prevent illegal trade had been taken earlier, considering the legislation of countries of origin or paying attention to the call of them, perhaps today the world would not have confronted with this much of daily increasing problem. Since the outbreak of the conflict, the Ministry of Culture has been guiding its stakeholders in Turkey within the framework set by UNESCO. And since 2011, the Ministry has been publishing periodic circulars to alert and to mobilize state museums, private museums, collectors, security forces, customs, and other relevant institutions and organizations to make them aware of the circulating Syrian-originated objects. The objects seized from Syrian nationals are being kept in states, museums, stores, listed separately and stored under good conditions. But according to expert reports who examined the artifacts seized from Syrian nationals, nearly half of the seized objects are not authentic. Most of the artifacts are being kept in the storages of museums near Syrian border, but there are also exceptional cases in which the objects are being kept in museums which are close to the place of seizure. Investigations of Turkish law enforcement revealed that illicit transfer of Syrian cultural property to Turkey is being carried out by individuals. No connection has been detected between the terrorist activities and the illicit transfers till this time. Also, investigations regarding the claims about Syrian cultural property being illegally traded at ornament shops revealed that those claims are not true. Our expectation is that such claims should be shared with all concerned actors through legitimate channels. Otherwise, this information compromises the intelligence. Apart from this, we are very keen to participate and promote the relevant awareness-raising campaigns of UNESCO, ICOM, or other organizations. The Ministry of Culture and Tourism constantly uses its official social media account and its website to promote those campaigns. Besides, ICOM's Syria's emergency red list has been printed in Turkish and distributed to state and private museums, collectors, customs, security forces, and so on. It is also available online. In addition to this, Turkish version of ICOM's Iraq emergency red list will be distributed in the near future. The Ministry organizes national and international meetings and seminars with participation of various stakeholders in order to share information and raise awareness at the institutional level. For instance, the last one was carried out in Gaziantep with the participation of the museum scholars, collectors, and prosecutors, security forces. Likewise, our country will host 14th session of World Heritage Committee meeting in Istanbul in July. There will be a side event about protection of the Syrian cultural heritage. Moreover, the ministry brings its activities for prevention of trafficking of Syrian and Iraqi cultural property on the agenda of every possible organization. Examples in this year are: the one is Interpol expert group meeting on stolen cultural property in Lyon. The other is International Congress on the Archaeology of Ancient Near East in Vienna. And the other one is International Expert Meeting on Preservation of Syrian Cultural Heritage in Berlin. The position of Turkey about Syrian cultural property is quite clear. Turkey doesn't have any other intention than returning the Syrian cultural objects to Syria under the guidance of respective international organizations like UNESCO, Interpol, considering the mandate given by the UN Security Council through the Resolution 2199. We hope that the undesirable situation in Syria and the surrounding region will end soon, and we will be able to start working with our Syrian colleagues regarding the return of the objects to their country of origin. Finally, I would like to note that Turkey is both hosting about 2.7 million Syrians and protecting their cultural heritage. When peace comes, Turkey will not hesitate to return Syrian cultural property and will not hesitate to support Syrian people for conservation and restoration of monuments being damaged in the conflict. As you know, we share a common history and cultural heritage, both with Syria and other countries in the Middle East. At this point, the problems we face are common. We hope that the establishment of a cultural heritage policy, which is dominated by the presence of empathy in market countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And to close us out, I'm going to hand it over to Brian Daniels, who, amid a lot of heaviness and discouragement, may offer a sliver of hope about what can be done using research that's being done now and using collaboration between U.S. institutions and experts in the Middle East.
All right, thank you, Julia. And let me express my gratitude to Herrick and the Art newspaper for the opportunity to join you this evening. Though I admit that my thoughts are very much with our colleagues from Turkey and with the people of Istanbul this evening, even as I make these remarks. I want to actually begin in a slightly different place. This is not, of course, the first time that we have seen dramatic destruction of cultural heritage in this space. And I find myself coming back to this constantly over the past few years, and I wanted to share somewhat of a personal story. I was working on a National Endowment for the Humanities initiative when the Bamyan Buddhas were destroyed in 2001. And I can remember what it was like to sit at my desk and have an email come in right in front of us, and all staff were called to respond to see if there were any ideas of anything that could be done to help protect cultural heritage in Afghanistan. I remember in 2003, after the looting of the Iraq Museum, when the international cultural heritage community was essentially asked the same question again. And I worked at the University of Pennsylvania Museum on at least a domestic response, what it seemed to be the only thing that we could do to try and recover objects after they were looted at the border of the United States. And then we came to Syria as the conflict got worse after 2011. And we began asking ourselves the same question again. And I think that it was out of frustration that at least we at Penn and others began to try and articulate and think about, couldn't we actually try to do something more? Something that actually might show greater outcome. At least we could say that we tried. And in January 2013, a colleague of ours at the University of Pennsylvania Museum who had come to Penn from Syria under the auspices of the Scholars at Risk program. She was the deputy director of the Directorate General of Antiquities and Museums in Syria and had fled for her life. She came to us and asked, can you organize a community-based project inside Syria to the people who it is possible to work with, such that we can help them directly, and we can help support their efforts in protecting cultural heritage on the ground. Now, it seemed to us at the Penn Museum at the time that we couldn't say no to that. But for those of you keeping score, the success rate on projects like this is relatively low. In fact, they really haven't been tried all that much, especially in the post-World War II era. And so we began to think about, over 2013, contacting all of our colleagues who had been so much a part of the American response and international response in those years following the looting of the Iraq Museum. And we convened a meeting in April 2013 where we sat around for 3 days trying to brainstorm possible solutions. And I remember quite vividly the day that meeting ended, because it was the day the minaret in Aleppo was destroyed at the Great Umayyad Mosque. And if anything, that was a reminder to all of us exactly what the stakes were in trying to actually do this emergency in-country work. And over the next year, talking to people in Syria, talking to international funders, talking to UNESCO, trying to figure out what could actually be done. I mean, we developed a set of interventions and solutions on the ground inside Syria, working directly with Syrian heritage professionals, curators, archaeologists, conservators, architects. And so the first, I would say, demonstrable success that we had in country was at the Mara Mosaic Museum. A museum about 40 kilometers to the south of Aleppo, famous for its late antique mosaics. And this was identified as one of the cultural heritage sites most at risk. It had already been caught in crossfire, it had already been damaged. And what we did there was to support the request of the conservators and curators to use a water-soluble glue over the mosaic, to lay a Tyvek-like material, flash-spun polyurethane fabric, on top of the mosaics, and then sandbag them in a way that was very similar to the preservation of Da Vinci's Last Supper in Milan, that allowed it to survive a bomb hit during the Second World War. So this was not exactly new technology that we were actually using here. We were going back to the last major conflict when there had been real on-the-ground preservation and trying to figure out what had worked then to try and actually bring it into the 21st century and into this conflict. Now, many of you are probably aware that the Mara Mosaic Museum was subsequently barrel bombed twice. But the mosaics have actually held intact and the collection is by and large secure. Now, the day after association, a coalition of Syrian civil society organizers and community organizers is now continuing that important work at the Mara Museum. And we have continued work at other sites in northwestern Syria. In particular, the tentative World Heritage Site of Ebla, which had been extensively looted. We were able to support emergency work to safeguard the walls that had been exposed by looting to prevent them from collapse. And we have continued work in the ancient cities of northern Syria World Heritage Site, oftentimes called the Dead Cities, which internally displaced persons now live in because they're safe, sort of. They're cool during the summer, they're warm during the winter, but they have not been spared recent bombing campaigns. And so much of our current work at a site like, say, San Simeon has been about trying to do emergency response to safeguard the standing walls and the standing architecture that has survived at San Simeon from its Russian bombing. And I will say in this work, we have been incredibly grateful for the continued support of the Ministry of Culture and Tourism in Turkey, without whom none of this would actually be possible. And there's two lessons that come out of this in my mind when we actually talk about doing emergency response in a conflict like what we see in Syria, and potentially Iraq as well. First is that we have to pay incredible attention to what local community efforts can do. I'm a firm believer in the power of communities to both identify what their important cultural heritage is, but also giving them the resources and the support that they need to actually safeguard their heritage in this time of conflict and time of dire need. And I think that all of us as people who are passionate about art, people who are passionate about history, people who are passionate about culture, we need to recognize that. And we need to figure out ways to actually more constructively support these emergency local responses when they're possible in conflict situations. If there's anything that the Safeguarding the Heritage of Syria and Iraq project has done, the SHOSI project as we call it, it has been to demonstrate that this is actually possible in a conflict situation, and if need be, we can try and do this again, though I will tell you I hope not. But related to that, there's a second issue that I feel like I have learned very much firsthand in trying to organize and run the SHOSI project for the past 3 years. And it really is 3 problems, and it's 3 specific problems related to coordination and funding. There are 3 specific problems in doing community-based interventions in Syria. The first is that it's very difficult to coordinate work inside Syria on a good day. And so there's lots of talking between Skype. There's lots of discussion about how to legally transfer funds. There's lots of coordination between people who may not be able to contact each other just by virtue of the dynamics of conflict itself. Second, there is the coordination of trying to actually move funding from wealthy countries in the West to where it's needed most among communities in Syria. And there is no international organized structure that is equipped to actually handle the kind of engagement at a community level that's functionally required to do emergency response. This is one kind of organizational need that just did not happen in the post-World War II refugee and IDP crisis. And so this is something that we feel acutely, that even while we're trying to coordinate work inside Syria, we're trying to actually coordinate this international negotiation as well. And then third, we don't have the development of a sophisticated philanthropy that allows money to be pooled quickly in order to respond to these community needs. The Mara Mosaic Museum cost $25,000 to save. But it took almost a year to raise the money for that $25,000 because philanthropic organizations and foundations in the United States are not necessarily, and elsewhere, are not necessarily equipped or attuned to the idea that you can actually make these emergency response projects work. And I have to say, I am incredibly grateful to Sotheby's and to the J.M. Kaplan Fund, who were the first 2 philanthropic organizations that really stepped up and said, we'll support this kind of work. Finally, I want to actually say a little bit about evidence. I've talked mostly about community response, but evidence is something I've heard on this panel, and what we actually think about evidence for creating good policy. One of the things that I have found throughout this entire conflict that has troubled me greatly is the inflation of numbers about the value of the Antiquities trade. And I think that we have a responsibility as scholars to develop the research methods and tools to functionally understand not just numbers, but what those numbers mean and what we can actually say about cultural heritage and conflict directly. And what I mean by that is the destruction of one site is an incredible tragedy, but there's a context to that, right? One of the great lessons that comes out of the massive cultural property destruction and looting of World War II is that the destruction of people's heritage is about the destruction of a people. And one of the things that we haven't addressed systematically as social science scholars is how we would go about collecting evidence about cultural heritage destruction, cultural heritage looting, that would allow us to move from talking about these as just collateral instances of unfortunate collateral damage to where we can actually talk systematically and engage with scholars who study ethnic cleansing and study genocide. That might give us some hope of elevating this conversation to one about crimes against humanity. we talk about this as a war crime, right? A violation of the 1954 Hague Convention. But what we really want to do is think systematically about how it is that we can marshal the evidence to talk about the persecution of people through the destruction of their heritage. And so I have been working with a group of scholars for the past 2 years with the support of the National Science Foundation to essentially deal with this problem of data, to develop the kind of work that's necessary to do research on what I just discussed. And so I encourage all of you to visit the website conflictculture.info. This is a platform that we just launched last week of 17 different research organizations from Sweden to Australia who are now actively engaged in researching this topic. And so this is a provisional answer that maybe we can begin to ask the questions, to collect the information, to really make cultural heritage matter for what it deserves. And if there's anything that I hope the Syrian civil war has helped us do, is to prompt us as a scholarly community to really get our act together, to actually think about the partnerships that are necessary to make emergency response work, and to think about the research that's actually required to really develop this in a way that makes us understand why people destroy cultural heritage and therefore how to protect it better. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Well, that is a really good segue into the Q&A portion. I will ask a few questions and then we'll turn it over to you all. But what I wanted to start with was a question of numbers. Published estimates of just how much money ISIS is making from the sale of antiquities ranges so widely. I don't think I've ever seen a more inconsistent number bandied around online. It's everywhere from hundreds of thousands of dollars to hundreds of millions of dollars. And so I wanted to ask, are these numbers something that we can really estimate? What reliable information exists now about how antiquity sales compare to other sources of income for ISIS? And is it something that, is there a centralized body that is keeping track of this right now? Brian, do you want to start?
I think that everyone's looking at me. What I would say is no, that there's not a centralized body that is keeping track of this information, and there are a lot of different guesstimates that are out there, and I certainly agree with the assessment that the dollar figures that have been assigned to ISIS trafficking range really quite widely. And I remember this, the first figure I remember seeing on this came from a publication, I think it was in The Guardian, which cited that ISIS had made $18 million at the looting of one site, which was a number that made absolutely no sense to me. And one of the things that prompted, at least in my mind, was that we needed to think far more about how we would design research methods to really understand what the value is of these antiquities that ISIS and other groups are looting. And there's a great body of scholarship in other fields of illicit trafficking by scholars who do really amazing work on what we call the problem of missing data. And that is estimating data that you don't know the answer, or you don't know how much it actually is. And this has been enabled by recent advances, frankly, in computer processing that actually allows some of the mathematical analysis to proceed, something that I know as humanities scholars we don't often think or give too much thought to. But we haven't found ways yet to marshal those advances of quite literally how all the other fields of illicit drugs and illicit arms marshal their data and actually get good and hard numbers. We haven't figured out how to do that for antiquities yet. And I think that what that's going to require is a very long, hard, and difficult conversation between qualitative and quantitative researchers, social scientists, and art historians, to be able to match type and number together. And so I remain remain, quite agnostic on any numbers, because I have not seen the evidence that would allow us to actually collect really robust estimations on site looting. In many ways, some of our hardest evidence is from the Abu Sayyaf raid and the kinds of finds that were turned up there. And there are other people on the panel who can speak about that raid much better than I can.
Kevin, I don't know if you want to speak a little bit about that and sort of what that told us about, just a snapshot of dollar figures.
Sure. So I think the thing that you absolutely pointed out within asking the question, and then which Dr. Daniels mentioned as well, these numbers range so much because no one really knows. It is impossible to put your finger on an exact figure, and if I get one more journalist asking me for an exact number, I'm going to go a little crazy. Another part of your question, which I thought was really interesting, was how it compares to other parts of ISIS's revenue. And I probably disjointedly mentioned this when I was speaking earlier, but I think it bears repeating, and that is that ISIS is looking to profit. So before they blow a shrine up, they're going to go in and they're going to rip the portable architectural elements off the wall, and they will try and sell those. They're going to do the same thing to churches. They're going to do the same thing to heritage homes and everyone's personal property as well. Is that cultural material at the same level as, say, oil? No, absolutely not. The ad hoc oil refining that ISIS is trying to do is really, but those profits far outweigh kidnapping. Those profits far outweigh antiquities. But that isn't to say that it isn't an important potential revenue stream and that it shows up. There was police action in Baghdad to get at antiquities, or a smuggling ring, just a general smuggling ring. And in that, when they busted them, they came up with weapons, of course, drugs, human organs, supposedly, and also antiquities, which really harkens back to some of the first arrests we saw in 2004 and 2005 at the Iraqi borders, where they were catching folks leaving primarily with shipments of weapons, and then there were some antiquities thrown in. And so it's really hard for me to tease out how much is specifically being made because all of this is getting put in together. You can get some approximate estimates on some specific confiscations. The public one, the Abu Sayyaf one, when they issued the images, certain researchers were able to go through and count them. Sam Hardy in particular went through and meticulously counted it out, and there are over 200 coins in that hoard of artifacts that they captured this ISIS official with. I can assure you that they did not all come from mints originally minted in Syria or Iraq, but they represent a variety of coins that were used in ancient times in the Middle East. And it would be difficult to identify them as specifically Syrian and Iraqi, but they're a good illustration of how much was coming in. And of those 200 coins, probably the majority were gold. And they're very, very much real. One of the rumors that went around immediately after that Abu Sayyaf raid was that they were fakes. Trust me, they were real.
We'll do questions at the end. Another area of real confusion on the reporting side, I think, is who's buying this stuff, and has the buyer profile changed in recent years? You can read that the largest collecting class for this is in Dubai. You can read that it's in China. You can read that it's in Russia, and almost every report will also say, and it's coming to New York and London too. And so I wonder, maybe, Peter, if you want to talk about sort of who are the reliable customers here?
It's really very difficult. It's very difficult to know, and of course, what do we know? We know that, as Larry mentioned, and as the people at the UNODC talk about all the time, that that material travels well-established routes. I see one of my friends from federal law enforcement over there. I'm sure he could talk about this more accurately than I can. And actually, I will ask you, JP, if you would like to answer this question, if you could say a couple of words about who are the potential clients for some of this material.
You know, from what we see, this is mostly coming from informants. A lot of the smuggled art from Syria, the Antiquities are going to Europe. We hear a lot of reports going to Kuwait, building families there. We're seeing some going out to Asia. We're not seeing a lot coming to the U.S. And apparently the word is that we're doing such a good job that they're apprehensive to start shipping to the United States as a gift.
That's an expert voice.
Thanks.
Yes, to repeat the answer, a lot of the material is going to Europe, it's going to Kuwait, it's going to, and it's not necessarily coming all that much to New York, possibly because we're more aware of it than ever before, and we're more diligent about policing.
And this question is for Lawrence and Zakir. Something that we've also talked a bit about is that a lot of these looted objects are not going to be seen on the open market for quite some time, 10, 20 years. And so I wonder if you could talk about sort of how to maintain vigilance and create policies that will have an impact over an extended period.
Can you repeat your question? I didn't understand.
How can we create policies that will have an impact over an extended period so that when some of this material starts showing up in 10 or 20 years, there's a policy in place to address it?
As I said, we have no other intention than returning the Syrian cultural objects or heritage, but I'm not quite sure about when we will give detailed information about those objects. As you know, I'm not a policymaker, I'm just an expert. But at last, we are going to repatriate the old cultural objects to Syria, including the non-authentic ones.
You don't really need a policy. I mean, the fact of the matter is, if things do start coming to the U.S., and I fear they will, we have our laws that you can't get good title to stolen property, and so it depends on when you purchase it, not when it's stolen in the United States for the most part, and when you learn about it. And traditionally, and even with respect to some museums, they will acquire stolen property and they will put it in the basement. They'll just watch it, and people just want to know they have it. One day it will hit the market, and the question is, can you prove it? And that's the whole problem. But at least in the U.S., the policy is that you can't have good title to stolen property. It's a question of establishing it, and that's why people, think, well, we'll hold it for 10 or 20 years and we'll beat the statute of limitations, but that's not necessarily true. In New York, the statute of limitations is from the time you acquire it, if you're a good faith purchaser, the time you refuse the demand to return it. In other states, it's when you knew or should have known that you acquired stolen property. So the statute of limitations will wait. It's a question whether the evidence will be there, and there are many cases where, in the Lydian Hoard case, the museum acquired it in the 1960s, and we started suit in 1987. So that's an old problem, but that's people think they can wait it out, but they can't in the United States. In other countries, it's different, and it's a question of when it surfaces. You have to continue the vigilance. That's what I was saying before. You can't. When the headlines stop and the media frenzy dies down, people still have to be sensitive to the problem. This is not the only example of smuggling in the world. It's just the one that's made the headlines, and you always have to be vigilant about it. And organizations like we have and work that's being done is going to help preserve that information. And I think that's the key to making sure that when they do surface, there's going to be consequences.
And last question before I turn it over, but I think this subject, especially if you don't work in this field, has the effect of making one feel quite helpless. And so I wondered if any of you would volunteer to talk about what non-experts who care about this can do.
One of the things that I think all of us can do is one of the things we're doing here. We're educating ourselves. We're learning more about this subject. We talk about this subject. It's incredibly important to reach out and talk to people. We have often talked about whether or not we could organize, an international outreach effort to talk to people about this and to make it, look, think about it. It was not that long ago when people bought diamonds willy-nilly and when people bought ivory objects, and we don't do that anymore. Behavior can be changed. It can be changed. We can identify antiquities as something that is part of our, shared cultural heritage and something that should be venerated and treated with respect and not traded willy-nilly and not treated as a commodity, but is instead as part of who we all are. And it's, someday maybe there'll be maybe we'll all be invited to a cocktail party and you walk into somebody's house and they'll say, come see my Near Eastern antiquities, and you'll turn your nose up and walk out because it won't be socially acceptable. Well, look, that's something that we can think about. We can think about what that means and how to implement that. But what it is it's outreach and it's understanding. And we are, look, the other thing to be well aware of is, and Larry, you mentioned this just now, is we're at a point where people are aware of this problem. Many more people are aware of this problem than have ever been before. And for those of us who have followed this for many years, we know that. We see that. We see, look at the New York Times and these articles are on the front page. And so we are aware of this. And so what does that also mean? It also means that while we are aware of it and while people are inclined to think about how we can improve the situation, we have to take advantage of this moment as well. It's one of the reasons why we come up with all these recommendations, for the government, for international governments, the United States government, for the art market, and hopefully for source countries and for specific things that we can do to try to get these things through and to try to keep up the important drumbeat of this message and to try to implement change and find some solutions.
Can I just say one thing? And I don't want to be the cynic on the panel, but as Peter was reciting earlier in his talk, all the things that the task force is talking about, I applauded it and hope it works, but it reminded me, sitting in Rome in 1995, I was the legal advisor to the Turkish delegation to the UNIDROIT Convention on stolen and illegally imported property. And there's a section of UNIDROIT that talks about import and export, and the talk at the plenum was, and in the committees was, okay, we have to have all the dealers create databases and all work together and do practically all the things you mentioned. And that was in 1995, and I don't think anything's been done really. I mean, there was some that came out of the English Dealer Association, the Dealers Bill of Rights in the late 90s, but nothing much happened with that. Self-regulation hasn't worked all that well. So I'm not sure how different it is now than 20 years ago. And maybe the one thing that can come out of all this media is that there'll be more organizations like yours and what Brian's doing, and there will finally be action where there's been a lot of talk. And that would be a very useful consequence of the terrible problems we're having now.
Thank you. So I'd love to open it up to questions. I think, please.
Randall Hixenbaugh. I'm an antiquities dealer, member of the International Association of Dealers in Ancient Art, and I have a gallery here in New York on 23rd Street dealing in antiquities. In terms of valuation, this has always troubled me. We say that we can't determine the value. I heard Deborah Lair of the Antiquities Coalition at the Asia Society last fall say in front of a room full of reporters that the value of antiquities that left Syria was $6 billion, which is laughably naive, considering that in 2013, the total value of the antiquities trade at all auction houses and dealers and art fairs, as reported by the International Association of Dealers in Ancient Art, was 150 million euros. The highest prices are paid for objects with very good clear provenance, the Gunal lioness, the bronze Artemis from the Nelson Atkins Museum. Looted and stolen antiquities have virtually no value. I've performed appraisals for several U.S. museums, U.S. customs, U.S. courts. It's not the 1960s anymore. Collectors do not pay top dollar for objects without clear provenance. The Abu Sayyaf raid, those coins could have been bought perfectly legally in Jerusalem by any tourist, any day of the week, for hundreds of dollars each. I don't mean to diminish the seriousness of the cultural heritage loss that's going on here, but the hyperbolic valuations, I fear, and I've stated this before, are leading to greater looting and greater destruction. It's not a great mystery. There are fair market values that are determined for antiquities in public auctions, so we can really determine the value of these things. By just stating we have no idea what it is, and it's obviously great, I don't think we're helping the cause at all.
Can you repeat the question?
Say one thing, which is that $6 billion figure does.
We couldn't hear over here. Could you repeat the comments? We couldn't hear what he was saying.
I just think that we do know the value of a lot of the antiquities that we've seen on the market. Almost everything that's been reported in the press, CBS, recently National Geographic, these have been forgeries. Very often naive forgeries that would never sell for any amount of money in the Western market. But to say that an object, a cuneiform tablet that you'd be lucky to get $500 for at retail in New York is worth millions of dollars is adding to the problem, I believe.
So for those who couldn't hear, the question was about the inflation of figures about the trade of looted antiquities and where these figures are coming from, if there are much lower estimations that we have on record that you can use to estimate for, analogous works that are being traded.
Right, and what I was going to say is I was at the Asian Society as well, and the way I remember it was Deborah cited that as a figure that was originally put out by the FBI. Now, that since has been, I don't think there's anybody who believes it's $6 billion. It was a figure that did come from the FBI, though. And I don't think that Deborah would endorse that either. I'm sure she wouldn't. So, but the point is that, that there is value there, right? There certainly is plenty of value in the material that is into the traffic system, into the illicit trade, and that we do know. I mean, we look at what it means to see these looted sites in Syria, and you look at Mar, you look into our Europa, which is a great example, and it looks like it's dug up. These holes are right next to each other.
But digging doesn't mean finding. Dura Europus was heavily excavated already. The digging does. I mean, I've worked in the field as an archaeologist. Digging does not mean finding. I think a lot of this digging is for gold, subsistence. Objects that do have integral value that can be traded. The antiquities market is not very robust. It is not very voracious. Sorry, I'll stop there.
I've spent a lot of time looking at the satellite imagery of Dura Europus. There's a reason why ISIS is issuing permits to loot Dura Europus. And that's because they're making a profit off of the findings, because they tax everything that you're able to sell that you find there. I would question your statement that just because ISIS might only earn hundreds of dollars from those gold coins that came out of the Abu Sayyaf raid doesn't mean that we shouldn't do anything. That assumption, okay, all right.
We shouldn't use hyperbolic values. The end doesn't justify the means in terms of reporting.
Right. So my concern is that no one is claiming those high-end figures who has seen the stuff on the ground. But I think that any hundreds of dollars that are going to ISIS are too many. And the same argument was made in 2003 through 2010 when the argument was made against the Syrian import restrictions, the Iraq import restrictions. And any of that money, even if it isn't that much money, any of that money that's going into the illegal network in Iraq to buy illegal weapons that are being then used to fire at American soldiers, that's too many artifacts being sold.
I agree with that.
I have a quick question about your question about what we can do. Not so much as a layperson, but don't antique dealers have something that you touched on also, or talked about, a database. If I'm a dealer and two guys come in with a couple of Egyptian artifacts, let's say, or something actually from Persepolis or wherever, I can check a database, can I, for something that might have been entered if it has been stolen? Shouldn't I be able to do that?
It would be nice if you could. The looted material doesn't get inventory.
But it does from a museum, correct?
It would be from a museum.
Right.
Although there's museums across the Middle East and North Africa which do not have what we would consider sufficient databases or inventories of their material.
That should be a real priority, to get the databases as soon as, I know you can't do it so much with, ISIS isn't going to let anybody enter anything, but if there were some kind of a database, at least for each country, it would help tremendously.
What does exist, and one of the things we've mentioned, is the red list. The red list of public,
red list,
right?
yes.
And those are guidelines for the type of object, the taxonomy of the sort of thing that might be looted and that you might see. But it's very hard to say. We don't know what, and our friend here, it's fine. We don't know what comes out of each and every one of those holes. It's impossible to know. There's a lot of this is impossible to know. But we can say, these are the types of coins that might come. These are the types of figurines that might come. This is the type of pottery that might come. You can identify that. And if you're, for diligent, the other thing is let's be clear. Most collectors, most dealers, most museums, they don't want to deal in this material. I'm sure you've seen that tremendously over the course of the years, right? There was, in the past, it was more of a was a little bit more of a cowboy culture, right? And you could acquire things, and you could look the other way, and and there is fake provenance. And you get documents that are in languages that aren't that you don't understand. And is this a letter that proves something was in Iran in 1968? I don't know, right? It takes an awful lot of investigation to try to stand that up. So, but mostly it's bad. It's bad for people to have elite. Who wants to receive stolen goods?
Can I just interject? With Fred Schultz, he had, actually he didn't originate it, obviously. It was this conservator who was altering objects. Let's hope that doesn't happen. And I know you're not going to do it. But the man, the 3 names in Britain.
The other thing I would add in terms of the database question is that, for museums, it's still pretty new to be, publishing full provenance data. I think it's only within the last 5 years that the AAMD made a rule that museums need to publish full provenance information on their website for antiquities acquisitions, and that's, museum websites are also probably some of them only 5 years old, but that's really, really recent. So it's something that I think is kind of at an earlier stage than we think.
Ask a question. Putting the dollars and cents aside just for a moment and talking about the political motivation of ISIS and cultural cleansing as an act of war, can you just speak a little bit about your thoughts on that, Catherine, perhaps?
That's a really important question. In fact, one of the things that I made a note to mention in one of these questions and answers is that a lot of what we're talking about relates to archaeological sites, but trust me when I tell you that the bulk of stuff coming out is cultural in the broad sense of the term. That a lot of it is religious material, a lot of it is coming from heritage houses. This isn't stuff that we traditionally think about being looted from archaeological sites, but more largely being looted. And you are absolutely right to bring up that connection, because part of what ISIS is doing in its erasure, in its destruction of these shrines and in these places where these people lived, is making sure they have nothing to go back to make sure that there's no record of that minority population having lived there, so that it isn't just that they have destroyed a Yazidi shrine and stolen things from that shrine, that they have then bulldozed it and erased it, so it's no longer there. And much of what we see happening in the satellite imagery of the destruction, we're pretty sure from ground reports is going hand in hand with stuff being taken and sold as well.
We've got time for one more question in the back.
Good evening. My name is Tess Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Antiquities Coalition, and just wanted to make a factual correction for the record that at the event that Peter mentioned and the gentleman from the IDAA, Ms. Lair did not say that the trade was $6 billion. In fact, our organization agrees with you that this is a huge frustration, the lack of numbers, and we need numbers. And for that reason, we've actually commissioned the University of Chicago to do research to try to get data to help find these numbers, because it is hugely important. And so everyone has mentioned there's a huge range out there, and it's frustrating to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thanks everyone.